Good evening. With this, today we start the final session of day two of our FDP of School of Mass Communication with a very warm welcome. Today's topic is towards critical media pedagogies by Dr. Anjali Montero and Dr. KP Jaishankar. Sir and ma'am have been connected with our school and have been mentoring us and our students. We are very grateful to them. Now I hand over to Bidu sir kindly for the welcome address. Sir.
Yeah, thank you, Ruby ma'am. So, in fact, I'm a little bit confused how to start the welcome address. Should it be too professional, a little bit personal, or more proportional and less professional? Uh, I know uh, Professor Joy Shankar and Professor Montero since 2011. Uh, uh, when I was struggling with my PhD work, I joined in. Let me do a personal story, and which is directly connected to academics. Uh, uh, and I have shared this story with many people in many platforms, and many people have told me to write a chapter on it. One of them is Professor Ananta Kumar Giri. He's an anthropologist from Madras Institute of Development Studies. Once he requested me, Bidu, can you write a chapter on it? So, and as it has academic orientation, then I thought, let me share this is a good platform because we are talking about methodology and many other things. Uh, in fact, I joined in TISS in 2009 July in PhD program, and I had no idea exactly who can be my supervisor. So my orientation, my degree was in development journalism, and I was assigned a professor who was in development economics. And development was common, and the difference was journalism and economics. And economics, which is too much quantitative modeling and all these things. And I am here to tell a story. I am narrate a story. That was the big difference. Then I struggled for 2 years to do proposal with him. So write. I think I wrote two, three proposals, and all the proposals had either sociological orientation or anthropological orientation. As because I'm development communication practitioner, I worked around 1.5 years in actioned projects in development communication projects. Then degree in development journalism. So what happened? All my project proposals were rejected because there were no hypotheses in the proposal. So as proposal is rejected, I was in stress, and I was thought to discontinue my PhD. I thought to drop out my PhD because there was no hypothesis in my proposal. Uh, then I met Professor Lakshmi Lingam, the then Dean of Research and Development. Uh, Later, Professor Lakshmi Lingam was the Deputy Director of TISS Hyderabad campus, and now she's the Dean of School of Media and Cultural Studies. And she asked me who can be your guide. I said Professor Jaishankar can be my guide because Professor Jaishankar is in my DAC, Doctoral Advisory Committee. Then she suggested me go and meet Professor Jaishankar, and if he agrees, then write an application. I will approve it. I went to Professor Jaishankar and requested him, "Can you take me as your student? Otherwise, I will drop out." He told no because your previous guide is one of my close friends, and we are from we both are from the same state, and we are close friends. So I can't take your guide, take you as a student, and he may take it otherwise. And I said, if you're not taking me as a student, then I will drop out. There is no other way because I'm struggling last 2 years to work on a proposal. But my first proposal was to look at media life of a particular primitive tribal group in Odisha, and how their media life is transiting from cultural life to media life. There is a shift, and that was rejected. And the second proposal was on community radio. And when I proposed that, he simply asked me, "Who is listening radio? Why you are interested to work on community radio?" go to NDTV or Times of India, some content analysis kind of job. So, by the way, I was very much interested to my research, and then I decided, no, I have to change the guide, not my research orientation. Then thank God and thank Professor Jaishankar, thank TISS. So I could change my guide. I could work with Professor Jaishankar from 2011 uh, August to I completed my PhD in 2016, submitted in 2015, and awarded in 2016. It was a great journey, and I have seen how busy he was during those days. In 1 year, I think in one of the years, he spent around 7, 8 months, a few months in Australia and Sweden, maybe somewhere in Europe to work on different assignments. Still, he was giving me time. Even we have met many times during lunch hour, and his few sentences was so inspiring for me, so motivating for me, that helped me to complete my PhD work. Even few cases I have remembered when we are discussing what will be my theoretical framework, whether it will be Foucault or Paulo Freire. Uh, so as I had worked earlier with the concept of Paulo Freire, that is a concept called regenerated Freirean literacy through empowering community techniques, which is a flagship project of ActionAid. As I had worked in that project, then I took the Freirean concept as a theoretical framework, dialogic communication, and worked on community radio and completed it. So I know that I know that and in fact I knew that not from Professor Jaishankar, Professor Anjali Ma'am. Later, that Professor Jaishankar lost his friendship with my previous supervisor. In fact, I have wished my previous supervisor many times. I have greeted him many times in many occasions, and it was a great miscommunication. In fact, till today, I always repent. Till today, I think I am not talking to only two people, one from my village and the other one, the professor with whom I worked for 2 years. So this was my personal connection with Professor Anjali and Professor Jaishankar. I have not only learned how to do academics, I have also learned how to do administration. In fact, when I went to him to tell him that I am invited to join in KIT, and in that particular day, Professor Lakshmilingam was in his cabin. I have clearly remembered. And Professor Jaishankar had no idea exactly where is KIT and about our university. And but Professor Lakshmilingam has visited our university earlier. She suggested me and narrated the story and told that it's a great university and you can join there. And Professor Jaishankar advised me, see, we came here and we developed a school from a unit to center to school. And that's the journey. And journey of Professor Jaishankar and Professor Anjali Montero, who started the unit, then the center, then the school, masters and MPhil PhD program. And it's a great school in the campus. Uh, so I become a little bit emotional. So coming to professional, and these two people are really great examples of interdisciplinary practice. What nowadays the national education policy tells about, or we do in many universities, crossing the boundary, crossing the border of the disciplines. They have done that from early days. If you go to their degrees, sociology, economics, philosophy, German studies, kind of degrees they have done. They have not done media studies. They have not done journalism. They have not done courses on documentary. But they're great people in the domain of documentary filmmaking, not only in teaching but practicing. And their work is mostly ethnographic in nature. They go to the communities, spend time there, as Binod sir was talking about. So engagement, their engagement is critical, and this is the day we have invited him to listen from them the critical pedagogies. I welcome you, Sharon ma'am, for giving your kind consent. Thanks a lot for joining with us. With much delay, I invite you and request you to deliver the talk.
Thank you, Bidu. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And it is, you took me also down a memory lane. And I, for one, have personally learned a lot from being a part of your PhD journey. It's not that, I was a guide, but I actually learned in the process. And I also very happy that we continue to work together in edited volumes. And, your contributions really has enriched the work that we have been doing. So thank you for being part of that journey.
Yeah, it's my turn to thank you, Bidu, and it's really a pleasure to be here on this forum and to have the opportunity to share our ideas. Uh, as we told Vinod a little earlier, yours is a tough act to follow, but maybe we'll take a leaf out of what he did and try to kind of connect our journey to the whole idea of critical media education, which we will be talking about this morning, your evening. Yeah, so as Bidu mentioned, we are somewhat outliers in the field of media education or media production or journalism, having no formal qualifications, but having sort of stumbled through various disciplines in a somewhat indisciplined way and finally landing up in the space of media and cultural studies. Uh, in fact, when I joined TISS, the name of the center, it was not even a center, it was a unit. It was called Unit for Audiovisual Records. And of course, the image that conjures up is of some dusty archive. But I think somehow we were able to reinvent that space and, with a whole lot of other people, make it what it is today, as Bidu says, a very vibrant and lively space. Bidu, is it possible to make us co-hosts? We would like to share a screen.
Saptik, yeah, I have requested you, Saptik, please.
Just give me a moment. Yes, I've made you the co-host.
You made? Okay. Okay,
You can do goes to both, I think.
yeah, no, we are both on the same
It's on the-
same account.
I've-
Okay,
yeah.
can you see the screen? Is it visible?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, we are going to do a PowerPoint as I know we are talking to a lot of senior teachers. And of course, I can see a lot of familiar faces, friends.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hello, everybody. But, we will just restrict our PowerPoint to the minimum.
Yeah, the PowerPoint is just more as a memory jogger to us,
Yes.
because as we grow older, we find the need to for our memories to
And
be
you have
jogged.
something else to look at rather than our faces. So.
Yeah, so in terms of, how do we see the whole question of media education and specifically critical media education? When we sort of joined TISS, at some point, TISS decided to introduce a course in media for students of social work. And we were given, it was a basic course in communication, and we were given kind of carte blanche to do whatever we wanted. We had to design it and deliver it and assess it any which way we wanted. So Jaishankar and I discussed it, and we felt that we didn't want it to be just a how-to course, a skills course that would, equip students to use media in the field. But we felt it was very important to use that space to reflect critically on our engagement with the media, how the media makes us what we are, what are the things that we do to the media. And so, and we really didn't have very much to go by in terms of existing templates. So we decided to use everyday resources, things like advertisements, things like children's toys, or things that we encounter in our everyday life. And starting from there, because all these are sort of the mediated influences, or the way in which media permeates our everyday. And starting from there, maybe try to look critically at what are these what are the kind of underlying, messages that these are talking about, and how does it form who we are? How does it give us our sense of the world?
No, we also didn't have a precedent to go by. But when you say media education, one refer to always, as Pidu earlier said, education, journalism, or other professional kind of media education, so to speak. It could be a institution that teaches media. So they were meant for professionals. But media education, as in, since media is an important resource in all our lives, there was very little attention paid to the fact that all of us need to engage with media, not just experts, not just people who come out from, say, a film institute or a journalism school. So that was some of the ideas that we worked with. So if it is such an important resource in our lives, which allows us to form our opinion of ourselves and the world, is it not necessary for us to engage with it? But unfortunately, the only media education that is imparted is in these professional media education institutions. There is no course, no teacher in a school uh, kind of talked about media, and in a sociology class or social sciences or social studies. So media was left alone, as if that we have to deal with it, and only the professionals, the experts were there, and we are just the consumers. So that was one of the ideas that we wanted to kind of engage with. So since all of us have the stakeholders uh, in this business, so we need to also uh, be engaged, invested in the idea of media education.
Yeah, so we felt that at the core of the way we look at the media, and the way, if you look at the way parents, teachers, figures of authority deal with the media, or even the state for that matter, it's very much within what we would call the censorship paradigm. There is this kind of moral panic around the media, which usually, of course, moves to the whichever is the frontier media. So when we were young, it was probably cinema, and then with our children, it was television, and now it's the internet and social media, and gaming and all of that. So basically, there is this feeling that people cannot handle it, and the people who cannot handle it is usually some kind of less powerful others whom we posit. They could be less powerful because of their age, because of their class, because of their gender, because of their educational level. But we think there are these less powerful others who cannot handle the effects of the media, which are supposed to be dangerous, and hence we have to act as some kind of patriarchal filters to make sure that what gets to young people, or what gets to the quote unquote masses, that's a very kind of favorite word, is only the right thing, which doesn't sort of wrongly influence them. So we thought that, okay, we need to first start with some kind of a critique of this very simplistic so-called media effects model. And of course there is a whole lot of work that today exists, right from the work of cultural studies, people such as Stuart Hall, to work by structuralists that are looking at media texts. But so today we know that the question of media effects is not that simple, that the way in which we incorporate media in our life, or the way in which media influences what we do, is not a simple stimulus response kind of relationship. But unfortunately, the mainstream media, as well as whenever we read about somebody commits a crime, it's very important, it's very common to say that, oh, he did it because he saw such and such a film. I mean, we still hear, or somebody is violent because they watch violent content, or they engage with violent games. So moving away from this simplistic notion of effects to the idea of what Stuart Hall calls encoding decoding, that actually what we are confronted with is a set of codes within the media, and we bring our own codes into play in making sense of that. And how we make sense of it could be very different depending on where we're coming from.
So in this context, I mean, we would also like to engage with this idea of the idea of media literacy. Uh, I think when you say media literacy, it means that you need to learn how to deal with it. You know, for example, a literate is a person who can read and write. So that kind of distinguishes him or her from people who cannot read and write, who are thought of as less inferior. We wouldn't use the word media literacy, which means that, you know, you need to have certain expertise in reading media. So what we try to emphasize is the idea of that everybody, all of us, irrespective of whether we are literate or not literate, have a way of engaging with media, and we need to kind of take that on board. So that means the media flow is not a passive, we are not passive recipients of the media flow, but we are also, all of us. I mean, I'm not making a distinction between mass and whatever other experts that one is talking about. So all of us have the ability to deal with it. So we wouldn't use the idea of a media literacy, because it kind of sets up a hierarchy from media who is non-media literate and people who are media literate. So we would rather use the idea of empowering audiences rather than control. That means we can empower. I mean, the media education, critical media education, is not to create media literacy, but is to kind of give us that space to kind of engage with media in empower them, rather than kind of talking about control. Uh, I mean, I don't want to go in great detail there, but understanding the fact that everybody has their own ways of interpretative frameworks through which they kind of engage with uh, the media environment.
Yeah, so as I sort of mentioned earlier, you know, one kind of possible starting point could be to, you know, collectively look at various kinds of media artifacts and to, you know, engage in a critical reading of them. And what do we mean by critical reading would be sort of, if you want to put it in a nutshell, you could say that every media artifact within a particular culture is informed by the dominant relationships of power in that culture, be they of gender, be they of class, be they of caste or religion or race or whatever. And these relationships of power make their way very subtly into you know, the commercials we watch, the films we watch, the you know, magazines we read, the posters, the hoardings that we look at, and hence you know, kind of uh, looking at these things and trying to understand that there are things that beyond the obvious surface level meaning of the messages or those media artifacts that need to be engaged with, and that help us understand how media forms a certain kind of an ideological space within which all of us are located. Uh, so for instance, to take you know, the idea that is you know, um, very often used in journalism, the idea that one needs to be objective, the idea that one needs to you know, uh, give facts of the matter. uh, you know, sometimes the idea of objectivity can actually hide the fact that every media artifact, every media text, including a news report, is framed in a particular way. There are underlying, within those underlying assumptions, you might try to be quote unquote objective as possible, but there is an underlying framework within which you work as a journalist, from the very choice you make of what stories to do and not to do, who to speak to and who not to speak to, how you even physically frame them if you're a television journalist. You know, each of these is some kind of an ideological choice that is being made. I think Ovi Vijayan has this, is it Ovi Vijayan?
Yes.
You want to tell?
No, I mean, he writes, for example, facts can also be ideologically loaded. I mean, I was, you know, the O.V. Vijayan writes in one of his short stories that, you know, in a riot in Tamil Nadu, one Brahmin and 100 others were injured. So, you know, of course, it's a fact that one Brahmin was injured and hundreds others, but, you know, that fact can also be loaded with framing. You know, it's a kind of an ideological intent of the author. So that's a kind of, I mean, an aside here.
Yeah. So trying to understand the frames, trying to understand the codes, we feel is very important for any media practitioner. I mean, earlier Vinod was talking about there was some discussion on the idea of reflexivity and self-reflexivity in research. So also, as media practitioners, it's very important to be reflexive and understand what are the codes that our media education gives us. What are the ways in which we frame reality given our the social position that we come from. Yeah, so frames are intrinsically related to the various relationships of power in society, and we as media practitioners also occupy certain relationships of power. We have a relationship of power with the subjects that we are working with, and as documentary filmmakers, for instance, we have been acutely aware of those relationships of power and tried to deal with them in different ways within the media texts that we are producing.
So one does it with the idea of social justice in focus. Now, Bidu just spoke about how, for example, A Visit to Village kind of, though it looks like a very harmonious space, kind of has relationship of power. He spoke about how students kind of discover certain inequities that are there. And so the idea is to kind of amplify and kind of make oneself sensitive to the idea of social justice and equity.
And in today's context, where the media is playing an increasingly important role in people's lives, and of course, with this pandemic, it's taken on a whole new spin with, in fact, media becoming very often the only, I mean, one's engagement with physical spaces has reduced so much so that, a lot of time is spent in virtual spaces. And then, of course, we know the kind of way in which fake news is proliferating, and it's not just people who are sort of media non-literate, who are quote unquote media non-literate, who are purveyors of this fake news, but it's there in all kinds of realms of life. I mean, people who are so-called highly educated are also purveyors of this.
The only way to deal with these kind of aspects of media is, as we said earlier, the importance of media education become all the more significant, because you cannot control it through a censorship paradigm, because it proliferates and it kind of it's there around. No control. There's nobody who can actually, even if it is possible, even if it were desirable, you cannot really control this.
And in fact, the whole media space has become extremely fraught, and a lot of battles are being fought in that space. Political battles, gender battles over gender. I mean, the way in which hate speech, trolling, and all these things are, actually having. We always think of the virtual. People who've been sort of brought up in a quote unquote real space tend to think of the virtual as less than important, but actually this virtual space has become in many ways the new realities that people have to negotiate with very material kinds of effects on everyday life, and particularly with young people. I mean, one has heard of so many cases of very people committing suicides, or due to bullying, cyber trolling, and all these kinds of things that have become a part of our everyday reality. So how does one equip people with some of the strategies to work within this very fraught space, I think becomes extremely important.
So in fact, I mean, of course, I don't want to plug our work here, but this is a film that we kind of made in 1995. And we realized there's hardly any material to kind of deal with an Indian situation where media education in other parts, like for example, England has media education right from the class of 3 or 4 onwards. There is a class called media education. So they deal with, they kind of discuss, the teacher discusses with them commercials or other artifacts. And, so there is a kind of a attempt at kind of engaging with the media environment, which I said earlier, there is hardly any space in the Indian educational system. So we tried making our own material. Of course, we are not continuing with it, but this is one film that if you are interested, that you may want to look at. I mean, obviously you can take I can put the link in the chat as well later.
So moving to a slightly different kind of area, but related to the whole idea of critical media education, we'd like to share this very small excerpt from a TED talk. Some of you might have seen it. It's by the noted Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie. So we'll watch it first, and I hope it doesn't create any problems while watching. But if it does, please let us know.
I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music, and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. It would never have occurred to me to think that just because I had read a novel in which a character was a serial killer, that he was somehow representative of all Americans. And now this is not because I'm a better person than that student, but because of America's cultural and economic power, I had many stories of America. I had read Thailand, Updike, and Steinbeck, and Gateskill. I did not have a single story of America. I've always felt that it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity.
Yeah, so I think that we find this a very powerful video that sort of, brings us to the idea of how, because we are both consumers of stories as well as makers of stories, and how one needs to engage with the media given this complex position in which, we find ourselves as media teachers, as media producers, as media consumers. So of course, a very important aspect is critiquing existing narratives, critiquing narratives that tell a single story, critiquing narratives that tend to stereotype. We need to understand, we've already talked about it, the frames within which these narratives are produced. We need to understand the codes. We need to look at how, you know, popular cultural artifacts reproduce these kinds of stereotypes, be they based on gender or caste or class, and how they reinforce certain relationships of power.
So you also simultaneously, of course, we have not spoken about that part of our work, also creating new narratives, uh, not just as producers of material, but also kind of working collaboratively, amplifying this idea of multiplicity of voices, trying to kind of put together or curate, archive together multiplicity of voices, bringing together many stories so that it kind of gives you not just one side of the picture, but also gives you a more holistic picture that kind of is now helps you weigh or kind of to the side of social justice and trying to understand and also preserve the dignity of the subjects that you're working with, which of course, many of you know, Biddu's work in community media, or Vinod spoke about his work with other narratives and community media. So these are all ways in which that you can kind of complicate the picture, so to speak, bringing in many more stories. And of course, it also involves speaking truth to power in the sense that you may have to kind of, in a village that looks harmonious, there might be equations of power. And when you look at certain part of this equation of power, then you're also speaking truth to power, then there are questions which are uncomfortable that kind of pops up. But it's our, as a role, as teachers, as professionals, as consumers of media, to kind of be aware of this aspect.
Yeah, so to add to what Jaishankar was saying, in a lot of our work with students, we actually, apart from looking critically at existing media narratives, we also feel it's very important to give them, or to try and get them to work with these, multiple narratives too. And it's not just a matter of skills. I mean, somebody may be able to edit and to run a camera and to record sound, but how do you create that sensitivity to that ability to listen, that ability to give space to the other, not in a patronizing top-down way that I am here to tell your story, but how do we collectively tell stories that are not told, stories that don't find a place very often in the mainstream media. So that has been our attempt with using documentary film and radio and so on with our students and the work that they produce. One of the and we found that the internet becomes a very powerful sort of space to disseminate these stories. And in fact, the URL that we put down, diversity.tis.edu, this is a kind of an online space that we've created where every year our students would produce a set of films around the city of Mumbai. I mean, we have a whole range of themes that they have worked on, from the 1992 violence to the decline of the mills in the city to caste in the city and so on. And in each of these, we've sort of tried to create an online repository which includes films. It's not just the student work, but we've also crowdsourced materials of films, writings, music, whatever we could lay our hands on around that theme, so that it becomes a kind of archive of the city, an alternative archive of the city that is accessible to whoever is working on issues around the city of Mumbai.
So I think we will close here so that we can have some time to discuss and hear your views and your experiences as teachers and practitioners. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Hope we have not exceeded our time.
No, sir. Thank you so much, sir and ma'am, for such an interesting and enriching talk. I would now ask whoever, all of us are bubbling with questions. If you could like to ask, or you could type in the chat box, I could like to read for you. Or if you want to, you can unmute and also ask.
You said what is first?
Can I?
I'm sorry, we can't
We
hear.
can't hear you.
Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes,
Yeah.
Anirudh, you are audible now.
Sorry, my internet connection is not very stable in the hostel, so I'm just unmuting myself. So thank you
Okay.
so much, Joy Shankar sir and Anjali ma'am, for that engaging session. It is always interesting listening to both of you. My question is to do with the very idea of being critical in critical media pedagogies or education for that matter. I remember during my PhD coursework and readings class, Professor Pavarala introduced us to many seminal texts in the field of media and communication studies, starting with Lagersfeld and Co's administrative research to critical research scholars from the Birmingham Center for Culture and Communication and Frankfurt School. From that orientation, what I learned about being critical is it is about asking tough questions about power and knowledge, who has power, who creates knowledge for whom, who has the agency to create knowledge, so on and so forth. In fact, these questions are being echoed by many of the contemporary critical communication scholars like Mohan Datta, Pradeep Tamas, Coldry, Lindsay Maniojo, Fuchs, and Westbrook, and Rodriguez, to name a few. But my question is, when it comes to doing research and teaching, for that matter, how does one equip himself or herself with that sense of criticality, and how to bring that sense and orientation to ask those tough questions to the state and its power agencies? Thank you.
Yeah, you raise a very valid sort of question. Of course, it is not at all easy, and it also is kind of, it can put you in tricky positions, you know, both in terms of your relationship with your students, your relationship with the institution you work within, and the larger situation. But I think that's a call that one has to make as a teacher, as a media producer. I mean, are you able to walk the talk?
Right.
And of course, students would always, you know, see through duplicity and, you know, kind of critique you. And I think one should perhaps be open to that critique, because none of us is perfect. All of us are flawed beings. All of us live with contradictions. So it's not about, you know, I think representing oneself as some kind of an ideal, you know, position to students, but trying to kind of encourage students to look even at themselves and the world around them critically, because the whole idea of normality, you know, is so, we are so steeped in the normal that you know, we are just in our little bubbles. We don't think beyond them.
No, I think the important question here is that it's not that we all work with constraints. It's what you find out. It's not that, you know, you're free to do this. In fact, I just, if I have a few minutes, I'll tell you a story. We made a film on set in a prison in 1997. It's one of our story that kind of changed our lives. So there is a prisoner who asked us this question: do you think you're free?
Right.
So, and he answered the question also. He said it's a matter of the size of the prison. We live in small prisons and you live in slightly larger prisons. So all of us are in prisons and we have to talk about freedom. How does one do that is a question. It's not that, you know, I am absolutely free that I can do whatever I wish, nor is a student free to do whatever, but, you know, we have to kind of use whatever resources that we have to kind of
also
push on, so to speak. And I mean, as I said, what we have to keep in mind is the idea of social justice.
Right.
Is we are not just media professionals. As Bidu said, you know, his institution is committed to more social justice, not just skills. So we also come from the same kind of a situation where Tata Institute is committed to, as a mandate, it's a institution of social work and committed to social justice. And when we run a media program within that context, we also need to take that on board. It's not that, you know, one can do whatever one wishes. It's not that we also have constraints like the small prisons or slightly larger prisons or even smaller, whatever. We all are in, have to deal with unfreedoms, and how we deal with it is our own question, but we need to deal with it.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor.
Beautiful thought, sir. I would now, Dr. Pranta Patnaik has raised his hands. He wants to ask a question. Sir, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. So nice to see.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah.
And same here. And it on record, sir and ma'am has also been the founding, laid the foundation stone of our Department of Culture and Studies in Central University of Rajasthan. And so we follow the same syllabus as TISS, and we hope that follow your footstep, and one day we will also establish a school of culture in our university.
Thank
And
you.
my question, my question, in fact, a kind of curiosity, since both of you are involved so much in making the films and such powerful films that, and in very short span of time, they compel the audience to think a lot about them. And when we are talking about the issue of reality, or the existence of multiple realities and the power relations also, so I was just curious to know, when we sit on the editing table, and what happens to that power relationship when we are engaging with the community, and then we come to the editing table, and then we are having a multiple realities. But again, when we edit it, does it mean that we are trying to show our way of seeing the reality, or is it from the community's perspective of showing the reality? So, what kind of dilemmas that you as a filmmakers undergo, and how you try to overcome that? So, I was just curious to know about that, because today only I taught what was man with a movie camera, and then I was like thinking, like, when he said that man with a movie camera is talking about the actualities, street, and then filming people because they wanted to move Hollywood cinema. But at the same time, when he himself, this man with a movie camera, how is it that the reality changed? So, you as a filmmaker, as the editor, how do you like perceive this process of editing, speaking the truth, and when there are multiple truths, and whether it is your version of that comes up as the end product, and the power relations involved in this film process? Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think certainly, I mean, one would agree with you that, there are, when you have, when you go into the field, of course, the kind of material you get is, uh, at one level, a product of your relationship with your subjects, and somebody else going into the field might collect a very different kind of story, depending on, the kind of relationship they establish. And then again, when you come back, you have this vast amount of material, and what you choose to include and what you choose not to include is based on the kind of presuppositions that you have, or the kind of story you want to tell. uh, and I think there's nothing wrong in that, provided one, uh, I think, is sort of critical of one's own position, and makes the idea of construction in some way available to the audience, so that when people see it, they do realize that, well, yeah, this is one way in which this story could be told, and uh, probably there are other ways too, and that, even trying to kind of bring in your relationship with the subjects into the film. So I think that's something that we try to do. We are not here to give out a predetermined message, but rather to make available some of the experiences that we have had, and some of the relationships that we've had in the field, that we put forward.
So in fact, we now talk about the idea of reflexivity and self-reflexivity. And many of us, actually, even as researchers, and I know at least some of your work, Pranta, that, where you kind of engage with masculinity and gender, and, where so there are ways in which we can use that idea to kind of critique the safe position that we occupy. So the filmmaking is not about us making film about them, but it's also a joint, a collaborative enterprise in which the power relationship we find both embedded in to critique that position. And, because we all have comfortable positions, we have privileges, but that privileges also need to be questioned. And so that's, I mean, for us, filmmaking is also not about telling a story, but telling a story with dignity. I mean, one of the things that we tell our students is that, when you make a film, the first thing that they need to do is to kind of take the film back to the people that they have shot with and get their okay about it. And also that the question that you need to ask is that, suppose in front of you, the camera, there is a person, and if you ask that person a question, please ask that question yourself. And if you would like to, if you don't like that question asked to you, or if you don't like you being shown that way, please don't ask that question. Because it's important that you, I mean, I talked about this prisoners thing. We never asked them about what crime are you in here, what are the things that you've done. We are not interested in that, because that will be a dividing practice. But what we are interested in is kind of find the common ground which unites us as humankind, like that Ari Chase, this thing that, talk about what is it that connects all of us. I mean, that's where any possibility of social justice can emerge.
There's a question
Thank you
here
so much.
from.
Yes, ma'am. Madhubanti Mitra, she says that, sir, ma'am, you showed us a video about a Nigerian author, a person carrying the intersectional identity and her struggles. Media stereotype has a major role to play in it. So can we think of a way through this critical approach, how media itself can play a role in negating media stereotype? So question is about how media itself can negate media stereotype.
Yeah, I think, I mean, all of us have to, play a role in that. And I think today with, the kind of digital media and with greater media access that people can have due to the, reducing costs of production, as well as the means of dissemination, which were not there in the earlier days of mass media. I think there is the possibility of creating and disseminating alternative stories. Of course, what are the strategies to reach those stories to, wider audiences is something that, probably one needs to think about. But, certainly, I think the today a lot more people have the means to tell their own stories, or to share stories of others which are not being told in the alternative media. And of course there would be different forms of repression that arise, whether it is from the state or from other powerful interest groups. And it is a strategic situation that one has to negotiate as individuals, as collectives, where we try to see how we put our foot in the door and see how far we can push it open.
In fact, the new media ecologies kind of permit us, to some extent at least, to kind of speak back to, the creation of memes, which many of us can do. We are not experts, and I don't have to go into detail, and all of us know this. For example, those are actually questioning some of the stereotypes. You take a particular narrative and just turn it around on its head, and it could be so that it can become a powerful way of critiquing that media artifact itself. And several examples of this kind, where not experts, but people like anybody who's has the ability to now speak back. So what Stuart Hall calls the idea of oppositional reading, kind of the reading against the grain. There's a preferred reading, but it's also an oppositional reading, where you kind of turn that media artifact around by adding a small element of yours, which and completely changes the meaning. So there are ways of doing that, is what I would think. And I mean, that's happening at the moment. Of course, it's not that they are I mean, of course, the mainstream media still, the legacy media has a lot of power over others. But still, we can, as Anjali said, put our foot in the door. There's another question that is about very similar question, and can we think of a way, this is Rosona, can we think of a way through critical approach in Indian cinema about women, or especially any particular community, how the cinema portrayed intersection feminist in film theory?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to make any kind of a generalized statement, but I would say that there is a lot of interesting work that is coming out, that looks at feminist issues from a different position. And again, I would sort of feel that one should not have in mind a certain kind of ideal film that this is the correct way of, this is what it should be, but rather see possibilities. And every media text is flawed in some way or the other, and it's a product of the position of the filmmakers. But how do you read possibility into that media text? How do you use that media text in interesting ways? And this, I think, is particularly important as teachers. You may take a media text that's you feel is extremely regressive and have a fantastic discussion around it, which probably you may not be able to have with a text that's very politically correct,
Some Foucault or Bourdieu or something, but you can actually do it with a commercial, which is everybody feels engaged. People kind of know that I have something to say about this.
So I think one needs to read possibility into very many different things and have a very what shall I say, iconoclastic and fluid approach in the way one uses different kinds of texts within the classroom in order to create this kind of critical stance.
In fact, the link I shared a film called Identity, which is in the chat box. It's of course made in '95. I mean, I'm not saying that but it's an attempt at kind of using. In those days, we use commercials and ask questions which are, kind of turns it around. So those questions are still relevant. You can ask the same question about today's commercials as well, though those commercials will look like a previous generation, our generation probably, and you may not be able to relate to it. But the current things can also be used around. And also one important resource about films that I would like to point out, there is a series of 12 films, if I'm not mistaken, made by Shoini Ghosh and Shikha
Ranjini
Majumdar. Jingan. It was actually telecast on a television channel called VTV or something like that in those days. It's called The Power of the Image. It's a 12-part series on looking at Bollywood's film. Very interesting, but they archival, but they're still kind of very relevant. You may want to look at those.
I don't know if those
not easily available, but in TIS we had a copy. So it's looking at certain kind of tropes within cinema, like take the idea of villain, take the idea of the vamp, take the idea of comedian, take the idea of, say, minorities portrayal and they kind of string together interviews with actors, say from Nasruddin Shah to Shambhini. Many people who kind of come together, speak about it, and also clips in the film and the actors themselves talking about those. So that might be an interesting resource for you to look at.
M.R. Patra sir has risen his hand. He wants to ask a question. Sir, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. This is Patra from Haryana. Just one small question. Thank you for that all those Trevor throws. The question I'm asking is that why are we so apologetic about our privileges, or should we be apologetic about our privileges? And that's something which is not exactly in our hand. Most of us were born into these families, and then we've done whatever we've done. And why are we being apologetic, whether we while communicating, while commentating, whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. If I sounded like that, apologetic. But
I'm not talking. No. From some of the questions, I picked that up. From some of the questions today, and some previous questions, from certain previous sessions, it seems that we are being apologetic about that. And should we be apologetic about that? That's what I'm asking.
Not at all. But use it as an important resource to critique our position.
Yes, yes,
That's all.
yes.
For example,
Commentator, what?
yeah, after you.
No, thank you, please.
I interrupted you, sorry.
Please, please.
No, that's a question that I mean, I brought up the film called It's Set in a Prison. So, you know, when you have an idea of what a criminal is, you know, and we are the law-abiding with the criminal, but if we can speak in that moment of, can be used to kind of critique this idea of criminality itself. You know, I asked, for example, in the class, I asked students, are there criminals in the class? The answer would be no, which of course is not true. All of us are committed some crime or the other. Only thing, but we are not in the jail because of our privileges, so to speak. You know, I'm not saying apologetic about the privilege, but also use it as, for example, as a man, when I speak about gender issues, how can I use that as an opportunity to question the idea of masculinity? I'm not saying apologetic. I mean, apologetic would be that, you know, it's like a mea culpa, I'm sin. It's not that. It's a question that, you know, if you're to question these traditional notions of power, so be it could be a gender power issue of power, or it's a question of caste, or a question of various other things that you confronted with. The only I would think that our work should be an arena to raise these questions and make the universally question these. That's where when you can speak truth to power. Would that that's an answer?
Yeah, I think
thank
awareness.
you.
Yeah, awareness of privilege is very important, because privilege is something that tends to get invisibilized, you know, and we look at things like merit and, you know, as if merit comes out of nothing, but merit is so-called, even the idea of meritocracy arises in a particular field, and we need to be aware what is it that what are the privileges that go to constitute what we call merit, you know. So I think awareness of privilege is very important, and it's a part of being you know, socially sensitive and being aware of trying to you know, look at the space one occupies within you know, a social arena.
Thank you. My problem was that because it's our privileges which have put us in a position of power to question. Because if you're not privileged, I wouldn't have a voice to ask questions.
Well, yes and no, I'm not sure, because people do ask questions. I mean, if you spend time in the field, people do ask questions, you know, and in fact, a position of less privilege makes you, you know, probably more critical in some ways, but the space to amplify those voices and to, you know, make them available is probably, you know, limited. But if you spend time with people and get to know them, of course, they would, people who are in a, you know, position of, you know, where they're being crushed by somebody else's privileges would, you know, voice those. And the thing is, we never hear those voices most of the time.
That's the thing I'm talking about. Like answering, you know, for the previous question, someone asked about the stereotypes, fighting stereotypes is created by the media. See, the problem is that we can raise questions, like Sir rightly pointed out. Even a meme can even start a flood of questions. My take on that, even Malala and Greta, they became they started as small questions and they became great movements. But even those great voices have not been able to nullify those stereotypes. So it takes a lot of big mass movement to be able to nullify that. Similarly, here when it comes to raising questions, I'm not saying that people do not have questions. They have questions, but the ability to ask questions, the platforms to ask questions, those things are actually privileges in our times. So when I have those privileges to ask questions, raise my voice, then why should I be apologetic about that? That's the only take I have. Thank you. You answered my question. Thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, I'd like to have a further thing that I think we need to think about what is the role that education plays in this process of asking questions. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, education actually stifles the innate ability that a lot of young people have to ask questions.
So
because
that's a different thing. That's a different question, because we are from different schools, not the schools that you're referring from, not the education that you're referring from. No, but again, I was having a discussion yesterday with my son, who is 20. We're talking about sensitivities. Sensitivities, they cannot be taught. They come. Some of them, maybe they are inherent or not, inherited or not, I don't know. But we acquire most of them through our exposure. And education is only a small part of that. All the exposure that we have, those things make us sensitive, and then we raise our voices. No, we get a voice, and then we raise the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for raising that important question. Yes, Dr. Saurabh Gupta, I wanted to.
So we'll take the last question probably from Dr. Saurabh Gupta.
Yeah, I'll
And
just. Sir, I have two questions actually. The first question is that regarding the financing of sensible films in India, because we had a time when people like Mrinal Sen were financed by government institutions like NFDC. Today's filmmakers who really want to send across a message through the films, the kind of films which you make, where are they going to find their finances from? And after making the film, what will be the financial viability of these films? This is question number one. And second question is that, sir, today we have a very confused state of affairs in our country, especially the political situation. Once upon a time, we had a binary of left and right, but now it's very confusing. I mean, if you say the secular space has been divided into many kinds of opinion. So do you think that we need a new theoretical framework to analyze these media trends today? I mean, will it be the erstwhile critical theory, or do we need some new kind of a theory in today's era? Thank you.
I'll take on the first question. I mean, so yes. I mean, I think you raise an important question about viability of these kind of films. I mean, we were making these films in a different context altogether. I mean, in the sense that we continued to make it till recent vintage, but we had an institutional backing, and so we didn't have to kind of. I mean, it was a fairly liberal kind of institutional backing, and we also made films with very little money. So that also allowed us to duck under the radar. So if you had spent a lot of money, then the institution will take note and say, how are you spending this money and what are you bringing it back? So it was possible for us to do those. And also we used to distribute a lot of our films. And, so since, but through DVD, of course, now that's also dried up because nobody now even knows what a DVD is at the younger generation. So the question is that, we used to also have, in those days, I mean, it was a little easier in some sense, where we had showed some of our work, even our students who were on television, even Doordarshan showed our work, NDTV. And one telecast will bring us the money that sometimes we spend on a film because it's quite lucrative. And of course, you can reach a large audience because even 1% of India's population watches, or even 0.5 watches it, or whatever, it's a huge number. So we had that privilege. But what you say is very difficult to find money for making films now, particularly documentary films, because there's a lot of funding involved in making feature-length films or in other kind of entertainments. But for documentary, very little of avenues are available. There's this organization called Public Service Broadcasting Trust called PSBT, which did fund a lot of films in those days. We made films under the AGs, but that's kind of dried up. So one of the problems that documentary films has is, which is related to your second question as well, that there is a space for dissent has become very small now. So documentary film invariably, because it's dealing with social and political issues, has somewhere is going to rub somebody wrong. It's going to tread on somebody's toes. So therefore, it's and feature films, because of their eye on the market, so they don't want to kind of upset any apple cart. So they're invariably kind of has control or regimes of control they put in themselves so that, you don't do anything wrong so that you don't get your money back. Of course, even that can go wrong. I mean, we have several examples where even censor board has passed, but then it has kind of gotten into trouble. But coming back to the question is that, so, I mean, documentary film, by their very DNA, so to speak, has some political kind of overtones, which is difficult. So that makes it even more difficult to seek funding from. So I think that, but also the most heartening part of this is that, in spite of the fact that there is no funding available, there are more documentary films and non-fiction narrative that is being made today than ever before. Because when we were making a film, it was so difficult making a film. Now I can do it from at my desktop using a cell phone, and quality is far better than what we started off with. Making films, a phone can produce better, and also there is ways of distributing it. But the only, of course, the issue is monetizing it. How do you get your money back? That is a question that is a very difficult to answer. But what is heartening, as I said, is, I mean, I don't have really an answer to that question. What is heartening is that, why is this happening? There are more young people are producing more non-fiction material, and YouTube or there are other platforms is a good example how this is being done. So
yeah, indie filmmaking is certainly alive, and with the crowdfunding and so on. I mean, one finds more and more people accessing these kinds of
in other countries. How is it successful? Is that because there are television channels that actually allow documentary films to be shown, but in India, I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of channels, and not a single channel would show a film. So there are, I mean, for example, we get students who come for our interviews. When I ask, I'm interested in documentary films, and if they ask the question, have you seen one? They said, no, I have not seen anyone, because there's no space to see them. It's not because they're not interested. Where do you see them?
As regards your second question, I think it's a very large.
That's why I left it to you.
And I don't think that I'm competent to answer it, because I think it's a question that we all need to have in mind as we deal in different ways with the complexity of the social reality. But I think whatever the idea, I think the kind of importance of looking at power, the importance of being critical of one's own, or aware of one's own position, and the importance of multiple voices. I think these three things are important, whatever the theoretical frameworks that you bring to bear. And I think the idea also of being strategic and eclectic is important, rather than being dogmatic and saying that this is the only way to look at reality, or this is what it is. I think the days of that kind of singular grand narrative are definitely gone. I'm not a postmodernist or anything like that, but though I might be using some of that language, but I think some kind of openness to change on the part of all of us, and openness to question where we came from, openness to ask questions of how we might have gone wrong. I think some humility, I think, is very important. More than that, I don't think I am competent to answer.
We also need to put our head together and think about what we could do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir and ma'am. Now I would request Dr. Bidubhushan Das to say a few words, and then request my colleague and a passionate documentary filmmaker, Sapti Garai, to give the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
I have to share one example of stereotyping and taking the positioning. Stereotyping, in fact, is it only limited to media? Are we, the human beings, are not stereotyped? And we are creating the content. And the best example that came to my mind when I was watching that video of Chimamanda's talk. In fact, there are 11 students in our first batch of master's course. Out of 11, 9 are Indian and 2 are Kenyan. And out of these 11 students, I think the Kenyan one is the topper in the batch. And one of my friends, Indian friends, asked me when I said that we have 11 students, 2 from Kenya and 9 from India. He asked me, "Do Kenyan can write in English?" Then I said, "In fact, one of them is the topper in the batch." So that is the example I had to say. What kind of stereotypes we have in our mind. And coming to positioning yourself, when Pranto was asking about when you edit, you are on the editing desk. So what kind of positioning do we take? So, and do we take the editor's position or the community's perspective or community people's position? So my point is that why should I take the people's position, or why should I take community people's position always? So, or if I am taking the community people's position always, in that sense, I am not doing romanticizing of community people's position. Instead of taking anyone's position, whether it's my position or the community people's position, I think we have to critique the position. That is my understanding. And in fact, when I was doing my PhD fieldwork, one day I talked to Professor Jayashankar from the field. This is the situation. What should I do? What position should I take? For instance, one community reporter is producing a program that women should touch the feet of their husbands. Okay, because husbands are the Ramas and wives are Sitas. Okay, so and there is a broadcast because it is community radio, and that is the community position. People are giving the voices. Okay, and the community reporter who is from the same community is collecting the bytes and editing, recording, editing, and broadcasting. And similarly, there is another program, what I remember, the importance of mustache. And in those days, I had no mustache. So I said that if you, and somebody told that if you don't have mustache, you are not a man. Okay. And that kind of program is also broadcasted in community radio because, and after listening such broadcast, I talked to Professor Jaishankar. Should I talk to the community reporters? Should we have meetings? Should I intervene? Okay. So I intervened. I because I spent more than 8 months in community radio. So then I was just like their staff. So I was involving in their meetings. And so sometimes my point is that it's not my position or community radio position or people's position. The thing is that we have to critique the position. My point, I had to share that. Yeah. Thank you. So if you wish to comment on it, Sarman. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely, you're right. And
You're
your
right.
work is a good testimony to that fact that, you disaggregate the idea of a community. Community is not a homogeneous equation of power within it. For example, what you talked about gender, or in your thesis, you talk about the caste kind of questions within the community. So it's not that, community is all good and, we are bad kind of a situation, but it's that every community, every formation, every social formation has its own tensions within it. And we need to kind of also consider that and you've done it very well in your thesis and also in your writings later.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir and ma'am. Well, it was an evening well spent, and a session with you is always quite introspective in nature. So I've had the opportunity to meet sir and ma'am once, in physical form, and the other in the virtual form. We had sir and ma'am took our workshops for our students, third year students on documentary production, and it's always a great learning experience from Anjali ma'am and Jayashankar sir, as always. And I would proudly say that I'm equally just much as a learner as my students when Saran ma'am takes a workshop for that matter. So we are looking forward to seeing both of you taking another set of workshop in the coming session, probably virtually, as long as we open up. So it was a really nice session. I thank you both for figuring out time for us, and I thank all the participants who was really pertinent questions, important questions, which raises a lot of, yeah, quite a lot of points. So it's not just about seeing ourselves in the larger picture, but how do we see the larger picture in us as well, in our daily lives in the media. So I again thank Ruby ma'am for moderating this event, and Vidu sir for welcoming sir and ma'am and organizing such events for us to learn from. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
It's so great fun to be among friends. And, you know, a lot of
Yeah.
Thank you, sir and ma'am.
Thank you.
It was lovely.
Yeah. It's really nice to meet all of you again, though we are physically so far away.
We hope we will meet again, like very soon.
Yeah.
In physical form.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
you.